Hey, it's Pastor Dave Schreffler, the pastor of Zion Lutheran Church in Hummelstown, PA. It's time to do a gander at the gospel, a time to take a look at how the gospel might be calling us to serve God, to love our neighbors, just to be present in this world where we know that God speaks to us through the words that have been written and the teachings of Jesus Christ. So, this is the second Sunday in Lent. February 28th, 2021, and the gospel comes to us from the Gospel of St. Mark, the 8th chapter, verses 31 to 38. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. So we often forget, I think we often forget that the people that we read about in the Bible were just as human as we are. You know, we hear stories about Abraham and Sarah. We hear stories about Joseph and his brothers. We hear stories about the disciples. And when we read them on the page in the Bible, they can seem very two-dimensional, very homogenized, very scripted, very one-dimensional. It's easy to forget that the people in the Bible that we read about walked and breathed and lived on this earth, had human reactions when they heard teachings, when they encountered different situations. And the disciples, of course, are very good examples about this. They're portrayed, I think, with the most human reactions to the situations that they incur. Yeah, sometimes they seem robotic. I would agree with that thought. But I mean, well, here's a good example of the roboticness of their reactions. When Jesus calls them to follow him, right? They drop everything. They leave their families, their businesses. They don't see anything. They just follow Jesus, like good tin soldiers, right? But then in contrast, we see the disciples also have very human reactions. They're deeply in fear in the middle of the boat, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm. They're the sheer horror in their reaction when they think that Jesus is a ghost as he comes walking on the water. And here in our gospel today, Peter's reaction to Jesus saying that he must die and be raised again. I'm looking for my text here. Jesus says he must be killed by the chief priests and the scribes, and after 3 days rise again. He said this openly. Peter takes him aside and rebukes him, right? Peter says, this can't be. We see this sheer humanness, Peter's reaction. So he doesn't obviously fully understand what Jesus is talking about. None of the disciples know what Jesus is really talking about. You know, to hear that Jesus is going to be arrested and suffer and die and be raised again does not compute for them. Why does Jesus have to suffer? I think it's the first thing that Peter probably reacts to. And that's the question of the week for us. Why is there suffering in the world? Why did Jesus have to suffer and die? We have a text that deals with suffering, so I think maybe we should talk about suffering because it's a very unpopular state of being. Now, being who I am as a pastor, I often wonder how dusty our crosses are. Now, since Ash Wednesday and last Sunday, I've been talking about dust, and I've been talking about how dust permeates our world, it permeates the universe. We're made from dust. Now, I want to talk about how dusty our crosses are. You know how dust begins to pile up on things in our lives that we don't take off the shelf often enough. I wonder those crosses that we have that we are supposed to bear in the name of Jesus Christ. I wonder how dusty those are. We have to really work hard to make sure that our crosses do not just hang on the wall or sit on a shelf and gather dust. Uh, Imagine how the early disciples and the apostles thought about the cross, the ones who struggled with the teachings of Jesus, the ones who denied Jesus. How often do you think they thought about the cross? Um, every time Peter heard a rooster crow, every time he was asked something, and did you think about, am I gonna be honest? Am I gonna deny something? I wonder how often he thought about that cross of Jesus. And what about James and John, the ones that they call the sons of thunder? They were the ones who came and asked if they could sit in either side of Jesus when he is in his kingdom. When they witnessed the crucifixion, Jesus hanging on the cross, I wonder if how they thought about that question that they had asked Jesus. I bet they thought a lot about the cross as well. Uh, you know, what we don't understand, and I'm sure if you've been in church for any period of time throughout your life, you know, in the first century Palestine, under the Roman occupation, crosses, crucifixions were an everyday experience. It was fear that is a matter of using that type of death to keep people afraid of the Roman occupying forces and government. Um, but then I think about you and me, thinking about crosses. We've not witnessed a crucifixion ever, right? Unless you've seen any of the movies that portray the crucifixion of Jesus. We've not been forced to defend or to deny our faith on the threat of being beheaded. So unless you are ready to carry that cross with you, unless you carry prayer beads with you, unless you pray the rosary on a regular basis, unless you are venerating the cross on a regular basis, I imagine your cross is just a little dusty. And yes, I did say venerate the cross. And I know what many of my Lutheran brethren are thinking, boy, that sounds really Catholic to me. Even just talking about the rosary, talking about prayer beads may sound very Catholic to you. But what does the word venerate mean, after all? The venerate means to worship, to hold in deep respect, to honor. Where do we place the cross in our worship space? Where in the nave, that part where the pews are, in the nave, where's the cross? The cross is right up front, behind the altar. In some, it hangs above the altar. We also have two small crosses that sit on either side of the altar. In this season of Lent, they are shrouded with the color purple as a sign that it's a penitential season. We venerate the cross every Sunday. If you walk into a Catholic church, of course, you're going to notice that most of the crosses have the crucified Christ hanging on the cross, as if he had just uttered those words, "It is finished," and then died on the cross. In the Lutheran Church, you'll notice that usually our crosses are empty. You might occasionally find a Christus Victor, or the victorious Jesus on the cross. But usually the crosses don't have Jesus on the cross. It's an empty cross. Now, why, you might ask, or the Christus Victor? Well, we hold, of course, the crucifixion of Jesus is very important in the life of the church, but we believe that we put an emphasis on the empty cross, the risen Jesus, the victorious Jesus, the Easter Jesus, though we don't want to forget about the aspects of Good Friday either, right? Crosses with the crucified Jesus, or crucifixes, as we might call them, were prevalent in the Lutheran Church and many Lutheran churches up through the 17th and 18th century, when the influence of Lutheran pietism and Reformed Christianity found its way into the Lutheran Church. At that time, then, the use of crucifixes fell out of practice, and generally because it was viewed as being too showy or too Catholic. And so we have an empty cross now in most of our Lutheran churches. And yet, we don't have a problem with crucifixes, right? I wear 2 crosses around my neck every day. One has the crucified Jesus, one is an empty cross. Martin Luther had no problem with crucifixes, and neither should we. After all, the cross symbolizes death, yes, but it also symbolizes life. And for us, it means then, loss, but also gain. And the cross, my friends, is serious business. We're to live the kind of life where we venerate the cross on a daily basis, where we focus on living that cruciform life. And that's a hard sell in our society today. It is an absolute hard sell. But we need to consider during the season of Lent, this is where I want to go with this little gander at the gospel. We need to think about ways that we can dust off our crosses and pull them out on a daily basis and, put them to use. You could, here's a small thing that we could do, is we could be writing our Congress people, supporting any kind of legislation that might help those who really are suffering from this COVID-19, but especially to push for vaccinations for everyone in this country. There's a small thing you can do, way to dust off your cross and write a letter, call your Congress people. Here's something else. You could decide that you're going to tune into a Bible study. You could organize some kind of event. My wife and I have been participating lately, donating money to the Thon activities, Penn State's Thon, and also the dance marathon, but also, they've been doing it virtually, doing different things. We've been, volunteering to donate some money to help out for childhood cancers and those kinds of things, So we don't have to be doing, in this COVID-19 era where we are still kind of hunkering down and trying to think of ways that we can stay safe, but also dust off our crosses, But when I think of the cross, I think of 2 things. I think of the thief on the one side of Jesus. His name was Dismas. The other was Gestas. That's traditionally, you can look that up. But one turns to Jesus and says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And how does Jesus respond? He says, today you will be with me in paradise. I think about that cross and how in the act of the cross, Jesus remembers the one thief, says, you're going to be in paradise with me. Jesus and God also think about you and me, right? Just because Christ is crucified, just because there is suffering in this world, does not mean that God forsakes us. God remembers us, just like Jesus remembered that thief on the cross. They remember us, and so God sees us through the lens of the cross of Jesus Christ. God does not forget us when we're suffering. Second thing I think about when I think about the cross is the ways that we can venerate that cross, the ways that we remember Jesus, because the cross is serious business, my friends. Too few people take it seriously every day like they should. It's not a popular message, to talk about living the cruciform, living the crucified life. That's not a popular message in society today because it requires us to deny ourselves. It requires us to follow Jesus, to do things that are countercultural with our time and with our path. But, my thinking is, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, is the time that I spend on my Facebook page, the time that I spend on my TV binging, the time that I spend scrolling through funny cat memes, I can give up that and use that time to do more Bible reading, to do more devotional time, to take out my cross, dust it off, and follow Jesus. So, that's my message this week for the Gander at the Gospel. I hope it's helpful for you throughout this week. Remember, your faith is not what theologian you follow. Your faith is not what church you belong to. Your faith is how we follow Jesus, how we dust off our crosses and do good deeds, acting on our faith, loving God, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Go out and be someone's thankful this week. God bless you.